Janet Mock is the New York Times bestselling author of Surpassing Certainty and Redefining Realness. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Marie Claire, where she's a contributing editor. She was a featured speaker at the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C., and is currently a writer, producer, and director on the FX television series Pose, for which she made history as the first trans woman of color to write and direct for television. Time named her one of its 100 most influential people in the world. She was featured on Ebony's Power 100 list, and the Penn Center USA honored her with an Award of Honor during their 2017 Literary Awards. A native of Honolulu, Ms. Mock earned her bachelor's degree in fashion design and merchandising right here at the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa, and her master's in journalism from New York University. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Janet Mock.
Aloha. I must begin by thanking my alma mater, the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa, for selecting me to return home to the island I was born, the island that raised me, the island that gave me and my mother's mother and the mother before her a sense of place, of purpose, and ancestry. It is not lost on me that many of my siblings and forebears are rarely, if ever, given a chance to be heard so loudly. It is an honor to be here with you on such a momentous day in your lives. Congratulations. And as I stand here on this stage as a Black and Native Hawaiian trans woman, I know I am only standing here because of the work of those who put their lives and bodies on the line to fight for self-determination and the elimination of forces that impede our collective liberation. I also know that the struggle for Native people, Black people, brown people, must include Black and brown trans people, Black and brown queer people, Native trans and queer people. And I also know that our movements must remove structural inequities that prioritize some bodies, white bodies, cis bodies, able bodies, deeply pocketed bodies over others. My selection as your commencement speaker is an affirming step forward, ensuring that the truths, the words, and the experiences of those most marginalized, trans, Black, Indigenous, and female, are centered and celebrated. I wrote my memoirs, Surpassing Certainty and Redefining Realness, to center myself in ways that no other book had done before. I wrote for the girl that I once was, searching for herself on the shelves of the Kalihi Library. I hoped my writings would be the mirror she never had, letting her know that she was not alone. And this is what our stories do, right? They let us know that no matter how different, how unique, how invisibilized, misunderstood, and marginalized, that we are worthy. It wasn't easy growing up Black and Native Hawaiian and poor and trans and a girl in Kalihi, and it still isn't. Existing, struggling, and striving in this way shaped me and shaped the way that I view the world. It enabled me to see gaps in representation, rhetoric, and policy. It forced me to dream and imagine a world where those gaps are filled. It emboldened me to create work where girls like us are no longer disposable but centered. It is why the act of sitting alone with your thoughts and the courage to record what you know to be true is revolutionary. My activism began with me at my computer, telling myself my story. This seems super simple, right? But when you grow up, like I did, in a culture that is intent on silencing and erasing, shunning and shaming, marginalizing and exiling, you realize that that act is anything but simple. Writing myself onto the page, onto the shelf, onto this stage, is an act that I did not do alone. If it weren't for writers like Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Zora Neale Hurston, I would not be here. If it weren't for activists like Marsha P. Johnson and Miss Major Griffin Gracie, Haunani K. Trask, and Hina Wong Kalu, I would not be here. And if it weren't for my grandmothers, I wouldn't be here. It was around my grandmother Shelley's kitchen table in Dallas where I learned about the injustices she faced as a Black woman in the South who used her hands as a seamstress to support and provide for my father and his 4 siblings. It was around my grandmother Pearl's kitchen table in Ka'aumanu housing in Kalihi where I learned about the injustices she faced as a Kanaka Maoli woman. She was the youngest of 13 who grew up in Ka'aava with a mother, Winnie Pomaikai, who never learned the colonizer's language. Instead, she resisted the colonization happening around her by choosing to only speak her people's language. Oahu was her home, her land, and it will always be, no matter who tries to stake claim to it, to something that is in fact and will never be theirs. You can applaud to that. It's okay. And this act of resistance lives within me, and so many of you here who joined protests and demonstration against this university's construction on Mauna Kea. Thank you for your work. These women taught me to be unapologetic and unafraid, to speak myself and my people into existence and power. I contribute to our collective liberation by wielding my pen and my body like a weapon against racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and the erasure of Black, Brown, and Native people. I truly believe that telling our stories, first to ourselves, to one another, and to the world, is a Native, radical, vital act. I first stepped forward publicly to share mine in 2011. I was born in the 1980s in Kalihi to a mother who was a teen mother with 2 sisters who were teen mothers, with a father who was addicted to drugs. I grew up the middle of 5 kids in communities plagued by poverty, low-resourced schools, drugs, and over-policing. I came of age seeing gay people on television, learning about the AIDS crisis, and witnessing firsthand the plight of my neighbors, low-income people of color, from undocumented Filipino domestic workers and Black men under heavy surveillance to indigenous Hawaiians displaced on their own land. If growing up Black and Native and poor wasn't enough, I also had my own struggles as a trans kid. As a young person, I struggled deeply and fought hard to be myself and reveal myself and express myself in a culture that mandates from the very beginning that if you're born with certain body parts, you are not allowed to be who you truly are if that expression does not align with what those around you deem normal. As a young person, I was acutely aware and uncomfortable with the fact that I was different. And I tried my best to appease my parents, my family, and my peers by hiding deeper into myself and masking my truth. Then in the 7th grade, the way I saw myself began to shift when I met my best friend, Wendy. She was a 12-year-old trans girl who had a green bob and wore short shorts and pranced around our school with her volleyball in hand as if she ruled it. Her boldness and her fearlessness to be fully herself no matter the consequence pushed me to proclaim what I only secretly acknowledged to myself, that I was a girl. My friendship with Wendy taught me that authenticity and living my truth was the only pathway, and she encouraged me to no longer present in a way that made everyone else comfortable. She urged me to present in a way that made me comfortable. So on my first day of school at Farrington High School, go Governors. Come on, come through Farrington. I strutted on campus in my tight jeans, a cropped t-shirt against dress code, and my curls bouncing, and reintroduced myself to my classmates as Janet. Relaying this now, I marvel at my teenage self, that girl with the unwavering sense of self who never let anyone's perceptions or thoughts or limitations make her doubt who she knew she was. And I believe that self-assuredness was the key to my survival, enabling me to transition through the halls of my high school despite teachers who blocked the entrance to the girls' restroom, despite those who called me by my birth name and incorrect pronouns. Despite their ignorance and intolerance, I persevered. And I left Farrington with a scholarship to this university, becoming the first in my family to go to college. I entered the University of Hawaii weeks before September 11th, and my peers were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we later experienced upon graduation the Great Recession, just as we took on tens of thousands in student loan debt. We began to broadcast our lives and politics on Facebook and Twitter. We became more connected and aware and engaged in social movements, from the election of the first Black president to Arab Spring and Black Lives Matter. As a student reporter at Kaleo, I spent much of undergrad asking people questions, listening to their stories, offering them space to tell their truth. I learned that we all want to be heard, and we all yearn to be seen for who we really are, no matter our path. This is a universal truth. Telling our stories allows us to connect with one another, and more importantly, it allows us to connect with ourselves. I knew that telling stories was what I wanted to do with my life, so I moved to New York after graduation for graduate school without family resources or a backup plan. I borrowed $50,000 in student loans to get my master's in journalism at NYU. I just paid that off. Praise the Lord. In New York, after years of, sorry, I know some of you will, that's the journey. It's going to take you a while, so buckle up, buttercup. After years of standing out in Hawaii, in New York I made the decision to keep the fact that I was trans to myself, and it was liberating to be seen as another girl in the crowd, another 22-year-old discovering who I was. It was the first time in my life when I was free to just be me without people whispering about me, without my transness leading the way for me. And with that privilege, the privilege of normalcy, I gained access. I was let in. I learned about writing from our nation's best journalists. I got internships at magazines I had read in my bed growing up. I earned my master's, and I became an editor at People magazine. I swore that I was a second coming of Carrie Bradshaw. And this was the dream, right? This was the American dream. I was someone who came from nothing, someone who made something out of nothing. I became someone. But I was fearful about proclaiming publicly a part of my identity that was heavily misunderstood and could lead me to further marginalization. I thought to myself at the time, who would want to attach themselves publicly to a group of people who are told that they're confused, who are told that they're an abomination, who are legally mandated not to use public restrooms or to serve in the military, who in more than 30 states, in these United States, can still be legally fired for being themselves, who, like hundreds of trans women of color around the globe, are killed annually for being themselves. I felt, and I learned, and I believed, and I internalized that I was less than. I felt that my voice maybe wasn't worth hearing, maybe I wasn't worth being seen because I saw no one like me on my TV or on bookshelves. But eventually, I came to a point where I realized that how people see me had nothing to do with me. It had to do with them, their limitations, their prejudice, their own ignorance. I also couldn't ignore the fact that my success was completely outside the norm for people who grew up like I did. I couldn't ignore the fact that there were girls and young women and people like myself who didn't have my privileges and access. Therefore, they could not access the same resources I benefited from. Many of my siblings are grappling with homelessness, joblessness, a lack of access to healthcare and education, and these interconnected issues often push them to underground economies that make them all the more vulnerable. These were the urgent, vital issues that pushed me to step forward with my experiences and begin challenging the way our stories are told. Choosing to tell my story emboldened me, giving me visibility and voice, allowing me to shift conversations about living at the intersections of gender, race, and class, conversations about how restrictive gender expressions and expectations oppress us all, conversations about the importance of representation. Ultimately, I yearn to champion our freedom to define and declare who we are. Most important, I told my story because I yearn to tell my truth, to create the story that I didn't have growing up, and show girls growing up like I did that they were deserving and worthy. And in the world that I see, trans girls, like all girls and young people, are protected and nurtured with access to schools and restrooms, access to unbiased, knowledgeable, and affordable healthcare and housing, access to all the basic necessities we all need to better live and dream. They no longer fall in between the gaps of feminist, racial justice, and LGBT movements. They are centered because they matter. They are centered because our own liberation lies in their well-being and survival. Each of us must fight for the creation of a world where we all have the right to define our identities, express ourselves without threat, and make decisions regarding our lives and bodies without political, medical, or religious interference. And we can only do this work together by realizing that our oppressions are not isolated, and our freedom is linked to one another's. We must be vigilant about being intentional, inclusive, and intersectional. We must center those who are underrepresented, who are often not heard, who are not in the room where decisions are made. We must center those most marginalized, those who are multiracial and trans, gender nonconforming and disabled, queer and undocumented, who have families behind bars and threatened by borders, who are Native and Indigenous. And we do not center them solely for their benefit. We center the most marginalized because it's the only way that any of us will ever be free. Today, as you celebrate yourself and embark on the next chapter of your own learning and contributions, I charge you to extend beyond yourself and include my sisters and siblings in your work. I charge you to show up for one another and to use your voice and your access and your talents to ignite change in your communities. I charge you to be courageous and conscious as we struggle together and struggle with one another. And finally, I thank you all for this honor and gift of being seen and heard, and I accept this invitation on behalf of anyone holding on to their own story. Let this be a reminder that you are worthy of being seen and heard, respected and affirmed, and given access to every single space. Congratulations.